All right, folks, it's showtime. My name is Chip Bromley, Director of the Ohio Fair Lending Coalition. Today, we're tackling an ongoing issue in Cleveland and every suburb and every city in the state of Ohio, which is building code compliance and making sure that our neighborhoods are safe and our communities are well kept. Today, we have Sally Martin, who's the head of Building and Housing, Councilman Hairston and Councilman Harsh, as well as Dave Roberts, the head of the legal department. Before we get started, I want to mention one thing. I've been working on in Shaker Square for the last 14 years. And there are an abundant number of large non-housing units, apartments that all require elevators. And we've had a number of buildings that are challenged in Cleveland as well as Shaker Heights. And this week I noticed that there was a transfer of a lot of properties that had belonged to Mr. Motlach and his family, and transferred to a new owner. And what I noticed that was different about it and what made a challenge less challenging was there was $1.2 million in escrow that was set aside for building repairs. And the building commissioner was coming out to make sure that the building was in compliance and that we'd start the season at least with heat in the building, which had been a challenge before. So at the point of sale, there's money on the table. When that money's on the table, it could be spent. And this is in the case of the heating system, as well as the elevators, as well as making the conditions of the apartments in good shape. So it's one way to get private investment kind of guaranteed when there's money on the table, and makes a big difference in the community and help save apartments and help save housing units all over our community. So we'll turn it over to Sally Martin, who's the head of Building and Housing and knows this subject better than probably anybody else on the planet. Sally, your turn.
Thank you so much, Chip. Thank you for having us here today. And also thanks to all who are participating, 105 of you so far. So we really appreciate your interest in this topic. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I'm going to be working with my partner in crime here, Dave Roberts, who is our new Chief of Code Enforcement Law. So I'm going to call him in for periodic updates on some of these slides. So what you're going to see in this slide deck is a recap about, all of the 50 pages of proposed legislative changes that are before council. So the city of Cleveland, for many, many years, has performed code enforcement on a complaint-driven basis. And while this was done as a result of limited resources, it hasn't worked particularly well. And I think we really saw that during the foreclosure crisis. It really came to a head. And currently, if you drive around Cleveland, we still have an inordinate number of vacant buildings, and we have properties that are in continual disrepair. So one of the first things that we did in the new administration was launch another property survey. And so we completed that last winter. And so the next step in this work is mobilizing the results of that survey. And this legislative package is the way we're proceeding. And so the point of it is to support Cleveland residents and revitalize the neighborhoods. And how do we do that? We have to be proactive. And so to do this, it was a big lift. Looking at all of the legislation related to building and housing and giving it a complete facelift. So we didn't do that in a vacuum. We spent more than 6 months on this. We had an external and internal group of stakeholders, and Chris Harsh is one of the people that was part of that, and he is going to be speaking with us today also. So Cleveland City Council was represented at this table. So we had Councilman Chris Harsh, Councilman Joe Jones, Councilwoman Rebecca Moore, Councilwoman Jenny Spencer. And then we had a number of folks from the Vacant and Abandoned Property Action Council, Frank Ford, Zach Germanick, Kermit Lynn, Ron O'Leary, former Building and Housing Director, and Phil Starr. And then on my staff, we had a number of us, as well as our city attorneys and attorneys for city council. So this was a real dream team for sure of many attorneys and others, subject matter experts getting together to examine the codes, think about ways that if we made changes to the codes, we would drive better outcomes in the neighborhood. And so essentially what it boils down to is an overhaul of the existing rental registry, establishing requirement for a local agent in charge for rental properties and also vacant buildings, creating a new vacant property registry, revamping enforcement with new tools to address nuisances, and revising existing city ordinances to ensure clarity and continuity in enforcement. It's a lot, but we think we have really hit a sweet spot with what we're proposing here. So why is it needed? Well, the property survey told us a whole lot. So we went out on foot all winter long and walked every single parcel in the city of Cleveland. A team from building and housing and other city departments, as well as our HHF friends in the different CDCs, all participated in the survey. Western Reserve Land Conservancy has in the past helped to manage the survey. So what we saw is a housing quality drop. And I don't think this would surprise any of you that the quality of the housing has steadily decreased. So the percentage of A and B graded properties dropped from 78% in 2015 to 54% in 2022. And we saw a rise in C graded properties from 16% to 37%. And obviously, we need to protect these Cs from declining into Ds and Fs and needing to be demolished. And what we found with vacant structures, and this again, no surprise, most were graded D or F. So the quality of vacant structures is very poor. What we also learned from the VAPAC white paper from March of 2022, which was led by Dr. Timothy Kobe on the Building and Housing Department staff, is an exponential rise in real estate investment activity. So no surprise to anyone, we are getting a full-on assault from out-of-state, out-of-country investors coming in and buying up properties. And our traditional tools of code enforcement, which includes criminal enforcement through lawsuits, if we can't get the person in court, we don't have a case. And so this is hamstringing us, especially with out-of-state owners. We're not able to really get anywhere with compliance. And so these buildings continue to decline. So one of the startling facts from the paper is that on the east side of Cleveland, more than 54% of 1 to 3 family sales went to non-owner occupants in 2021. And 24% on the west side. So this rise and this decline of home ownership has true consequences for our neighborhoods. So the idea of appointing a local agent in charge and requiring that anybody who resides outside of Cuyahoga County is required to have a local agent in charge who is a human being who actually resides in Cuyahoga County or a contiguous county is really nothing new. This is done in suburbs. We did it in South Euclid. I know that it's done in most suburbs. And it's a game changer because it means that we have a human being we can take to court and hold accountable for the property condition. And that had not been done in Cleveland in the past. You know, we were chasing around LLCs, trying to hope that we get somebody in court and not having a great deal of success. So the rental registry in Cleveland worked in a very different way than some other rental registries. You know, we would basically take anybody who, was coming to us to register their rental property. They would pay their fee. They would renew their rental occupancy yearly. They wouldn't really have to revet their paperwork. They would just send in their check. And it was not delivering the results we were hoping for. And so now there's a track for all non-owner occupied residential units have to be registered with the city. This is a very clear directive. If you don't live in it, it's a residential unit, you have to register with the city. This eliminates loopholes. We also were looking at things like HVAC problems all throughout the city. So all winter long last year, we were getting no heat calls. It was a weekly occurrence. You know, large buildings, no heat. And so one of the pieces that that's been added to the rental registry is a requirement that if it's a 4+ unit building, they need to certify their HVAC with a certified contractor every year. So they have to provide certification that the unit is in good working order, which essentially means they're going to have somebody look at the unit every year to make sure it's operational. It sounds like a small thing. It's a huge thing because we have buildings still in Shaker Square, especially that have had most of their boilers not working for several years. They have used space heaters to heat the apartments, and not surprisingly, there's occasional fires. So the new legislation also grants us authority to revoke registration for noncompliance. So here is a schematic of how it all works. So if you are a non-owner occupier owner of residential property, you have to register it. You have to provide a property address. You have to tell us the owner's identity, and you need to appoint a local agent in charge if you don't live here. In order to rent in good standing, so it's sort of a two-part process, is the unit lead safe certified? Have you corrected any lead hazard control orders? You have to be in compliance with notices of violation. If you have 4+ units, your HVAC has to be examined by a licensed professional. 4+ units, you have to be up to date on whatever utilities you're paying on behalf of the tenants. So we've seen large buildings with a $220,000 water bill that remains unpaid. We also are asking that you be up to date on property taxes. This has also been done in the suburbs with great effect, has not been done in Cleveland. And so you will get a certificate in good standing to rent. So a certificate approving rental occupancy if you can meet these requirements. Otherwise, yes, you have to register it, but you also need to get the certificate in good standing if you actually have a human being living there. So one of the earth-shattering things that we're proposing here, and I think this is what we're going to probably get a lot of questions on, is a vacant property registry. So I can speak from past experience that this is closely modeled with the South Euclid legislation that passed in 2010. That was an absolute game changer for the city of South Euclid. So South Euclid, unlike some other inner-ring suburbs, has never had point of sale. It passed once and then was voted down in a referendum, and therefore no one, was going to broach that subject again. But what we were finding there is that we had an influx of vacant properties during the foreclosure crisis, and we needed a new tool to address them. Because by not having one, we were rolling out the red carpet for every bottom-feeding flipper and speculator out there. And so what we did and what we're proposing here is to create a vacant property registry that for residential parcels works like a point of sale. So it requires an annual registration of vacant buildings and identification of a local agent in charge. It requires an inspection of the property inside and out by Building and Housing for code violations within 1 year before it is to be sold. And upon transfer, if it has a code violation, the buyer is required to put $5,000 in escrow, assume the violations, and complete repairs within 6 months. For commercial and industrial properties, it works a little bit differently. So it works a little bit more like a foreclosure bond, if you're familiar with that. So those buildings have to be registered each year, and they require between a $5,000 and $15,000 cash bond upon registration. And the city is going to be able to draw down on those bonds for any kind of nuisance abatement activities. And so this is essentially how it works, a schematic drawing of this. You have to register each year. You're required to have basic upkeep, meaning your roof can't be compromised, graffiti can't be on your building, it needs to be weather tight. You need a city inspection before transfer. And then if it is a commercial building, depending if it's under 10,000 square feet, it's a $5,000 bond. If it's over 10,000 square feet, it's a $15,000 bond with a service fee each year to handle administrative costs, and also the ability for us to draw down on that bond for any corrections that we have to make to your building. And then we can request a larger bond if need be. So parking garages, this has been another big issue. So oftentimes we get questions, well, how often does the city inspect parking garages? And currently this is really done only when there's a complaint. And so very similar to what the city has done for many years with facades, where we require the owners of taller buildings to certify their facade every 5 years through a civil engineer. They come out and give an assessment. Is it safe? Do they need to do tuck pointing? What needs to make that safe? These parking garages will require an inspection every 5 years. And if it is in unsatisfactory condition, a remediation plan would need to be put forward by the owner of the garage. Civil tickets. So this is a brand new thought process for building and housing, and also fire, health, and other departments. Currently, civil tickets are used by the Department of Waste in Cleveland to allow for a fine. Let's say you leave your trash cans out on the curb, you can get a fine, and if you fail to pay that fine, it can be assessed to your property tax duplicate if it remains unpaid. This would allow us to expand the use of civil tickets to many, many other violation types, including building and housing codes, zoning codes, fire codes, health codes, and others. And so an example of this is we were in a building on Shaker Square. We found that the fire suppression system was not working properly. It was alarming incorrectly, and it needed to be repaired. And the fire marshal said, well, it's frustrating because the only tool I have is to issue a violation notice. That can take a month for someone to correct, but this is a very urgent matter. So here they could issue a civil ticket every day that it's out of compliance. And so the fines could add up. And I think it would help, especially with nuisance and safety conditions, really be a game changer in terms of bringing around a faster compliance than we're currently getting. So here's some examples of the things that could be included. So you leave trash all out on your porch, you have tires everywhere, we could issue a ticket. Lead safe, we would be using it heavily for that. So if you fail to get your lead safe certification, we would be using civil tickets as one means of getting you into compliance faster. So you've all seen them, cars parked all over. People with storage containers on their property, boats. This would allow us to really crack down on some of the nuisance conditions that we see every day in the city that frustrate people. So also what we found too is that demolition should not be the only nuisance abatement tool. And here's an example. We were over in the Shaker Square area. One of those apartment buildings, it's an 8-story apartment building. The elevator has gone down. The owner has a very bad pay situation with the elevator repair companies in town, and they don't want to go do work for them. And so the elevator doesn't get repaired. And now we have senior residents living on the 8th floor, unable to get medicine. They can't get to the doctor. We want funding authority to be able to use some of our existing demolition funds to go and make repairs on behalf of the owner and then charge him back for those repairs. So we could fix a broken elevator. We could fix a heating system that goes out in the winter where the owner is not stepping forward. We could fix a collapsed porch that's causing hazard, but the building is salvageable. So it gives us another tool other than demolition to abate nuisances, because we have that authority on our books, but we never had the funding stream. And so we're asking for that in this package of legislation. The other thing, and this is more of a suburban model, currently the way that the city approaches high grass and weeds is a little bit strange. It's very departmentalized. So we have, if it's a vacant property, it goes to parks. If it is an occupied property, it goes to health. And there's a very protracted ticketing process that ends up in court for high grass on residential properties that takes months sometimes to resolve. And so what we're proposing here is that we get one 72-hour notice per growing season with the right to abate whenever it's out of compliance during the season. And here again, this is more of a suburban model that we think is worth emulating. Certificates of disclosure. So when you sell a property in Cleveland, depending on the size of the building, you either need a certificate of disclosure or a statement of authorized use. And so what we're doing is merging these two processes to create one process, and it will just be simply certificate of disclosure. So this would minimize loopholes, and all parcels transferred have to provide property condition disclosures, zoning information, before it transfers, and also allows us for more aggressive prosecution. So certificate of disclosure, when prosecuted aggressively, will allow us to get people into court who are flipping properties and wantonly disregarding the rules in the city of Cleveland. And we have found many of them, and many of them are LLCs. So we think this is going to cut a lot of the loopholes out. And I'm going to call on Dave Roberts, our new code enforcement law chief, to kind of walk us through some of the consistency and clarification changes that we're making or proposing to make in this code, which we think are going to drive better outcomes. I don't know if Dave, if you can unmute.
To unmute.
There you go.
All right, am I unmuted?
You are.
Okay, so for many years, our different codes, health, fire, building, housing, zoning, have not been updated. And in many cases, they're not consistent with each other. And so one of the goals here is to make them all consistent. The most important thing is every department should have the ability to issue written orders. And then when people fail to comply with those written orders, they should be able to be prosecuted for first-degree misdemeanors. And so we're making sure that's clear for all the different codes. We also want to make the ownership, or the notice should be the same. And it should be clear that every department can use all the possible ways of doing notice that comport with due process, so that you don't have people in court arguing, oh, you didn't properly serve me. You should have sent it to this particular address, or should have delivered to me in a certain way. So we're updating all the codes to indicate that the various methods are available as long as they comport with due process, and each department can use any of the methods. And then we're also trying to make it easier to get search warrants. We want to respect the right of people's privacy to be free from searches under the Fourth Amendment, but we want to clarify that it's also a requirement that people allow for inspection. And so we're indicating that we may do what's called administrative warrants, which is to say, even if we don't show the judge that there's probable cause to believe there's a violation, sometimes it's just necessary for the building department to inspect particular types of buildings. And as long as we do that in a consistent way on a schedule, so that we're not singling anyone out, then we can begin that. And we want to clarify that you don't have to search for consent from everyone before you seek a search warrant. That our policy is to ask for consent first. No reason not to. It lets the person know we're coming, and they may say yes, and that makes it easier for us. But that we don't have to beat the bushes to look for people who aren't available to ask them for consent. If we can't find them after some effort, then we could just go to the court and ask for a search warrant, and then get the search warrant, particularly for vacant properties, and then inspect those vacant properties. So that is the goal of combining and making uniform the various code sections so we can prosecute all of our codes.
Thank you. So at this point, I'd like to transition over to Councilman Hairston and then Councilman Harsh for some feedback on their thoughts about the legislative package. And then we'll open it up to questions, and Harriet is going to be moderating the questions that come in the chat, and then we'll present that to the panel at the end of these remarks. And so I see you, Councilman Harsh, and I'm assuming Councilman Hairston is waiting the wings here, and he'll be, there he is.
There we go. They have me up in the corner. Absolutely. But again, thank you to the Ohio Fair Lending Coalition. Thank you, Director Sally Martin. Thank you, Chip Bromley, and all of those who helped put this forum together today. As the director indicated, several colleagues of mine on Cleveland City Council, along with Director Martin and a host of others, hunkered down and really got together to go through several ordinances that currently exist on our books and deliberated on how we can enhance those, and what other changes or what other new policies we can bring forward to address some of the issues that many of us see each and every day around the city of Cleveland. This is my second glance at this package. Councilman Harsh has been working with this group a little bit more in depth. And this is my second glance at this information that has been submitted today. And just for those who are listening, as the director indicated, each of the ordinances, new and enhanced ordinances, will come before the DPNS committee in Cleveland City Council. So there will be a period where we will thoroughly vet each of the ordinances, each of the changes that are being recommended by the coalition who came together to present the proposed pieces. There will be opportunity for public comment during those deliberations, whether it is written, whether it's in person. We will thoroughly vet each of the pieces that has been presented. As the director said, this was really not done in a vacuum. There was a lot of voices that went into putting together these changes, these enhancements, as we've heard today during the presentation. I'm sorry, I was getting somebody's background. Yeah, that will be it. All right, I'll just talk through it.
We could probably mute everybody if our illustrious host wants to do that.
Got it. Okay, well, I'll keep going. So a couple of things really quick, and I'll move on to Councilman Harsh, is that a couple of things that really stood out to me as I shared with the director and our new Chief Assistant Director of Law and Code Enforcement, who's been excellent, by the way, since coming on board. And I say that we are 2 for 2 for the Roberts team here in City Hall. And a couple of things that stood out to me was the establishment of the local agent. One of the hardest things as a council person as well has been trying to track down individuals who own these properties. You get a UK address, you get a out of Ohio address. It is very difficult because a lot of times these entities are layered, right? There are multiple layers in between. And in fact, I had to deal with one now. I won't say the name of the organization. They are going through a court hearing with the receivership and all the kind of situations that they have going. And I had to find the attorney who organized their entity. I then had to find the receiver's attorney. I had to go through multiple layers to try to track down exactly who these individuals and who this group was, to figure out what was going on and what do they intend to do with these properties. So establishing the local agent, I think, will be a very, very, very helpful to us when we are trying to address these nuisance properties that line our streets. The other point that stood out to me that I really enjoyed was the new tool to address nuisances, the civil tickets. You know, oftentimes what I've heard from inspectors that the time it takes to process the misdemeanor violation notice or the misdemeanor tickets, it can be much. But if there was something else that the inspectors could have or individuals can have to address the everyday quality of life issues that can help speed up the process, I thought was a great point. The civil tickets, the fines, they can print, they can post on the door right then and there, to chat with individuals to say, hey, you have these issues here, and they're looking at a smaller fine, but I think enough of the smaller fines can have a great impact on the situations that we see in our neighborhoods. One of the challenges that I have shared with the department is about enforcement. How it's one thing to enact or kind of put forth good policy, right? But it's another thing to enforce that policy, making sure that there is enough bodies around to do the work, making sure that folks will follow up on these issues. Are we going to be overly aggressive? Are we going to be, are we going to be heavy-handed on the policy? So those are a lot of things that we'll flush out as we hear these pieces through our committee process, and we will be going out and seeking other voices who are also in this market and who does this work as well. So that way we can hear from everyone with their input and how they believe that these pieces will help us. And I think we also have to consider the unintended consequences as well. I saw one of the comments in the chat about how they lived in an apartment on Shaker Square, and because of whatever citations, whatever issues that occurred, then they passed that burden on to the tenants there. And so I think not only that, but I think there could be other intended consequences, but we want to make sure we flush all of those out and really have a robust discussion on what those possibly could be and how we can head those off, so that way we don't have to deal with those, really in a bad way down the line. Councilman?
Yep. All right. So, yes, everything he said is true. I know that Chairman Hairston is going to bring this to the table and give us as much time as we need to really dig into this and make sure that all the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted. Because this is a really massive undertaking, and I think that Director Martin O'Toole deserves a huge round of applause. Or we're on Zoom, we won't do that, but credit for opening up the entire housing code to really get a good look under the hood and see what needs to be changed. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out Zach Germaniak's contribution to this as well. He let me go down to CSU and pulled out got some dry erase markers in the whiteboard, and we just went to town on all the problems in the world and trying to make those connections. And one of the reasons this is a 50-page overhaul is that you have to dig into all the different sections that cross-reference each other. And that really came out when we were doing the local agent in charge, that we had different definitions and different terms, and there were ways to consider people with different responsibilities throughout the housing code, and we really had to align all of that. So I think this has probably been more than 6 months in the making. This has probably been, a year or 2 or 3 for some of us, and it's great to finally have this slate of reforms in front of us. The local agent in charge is the really, I think, big flash in the pan here. I think this is what really is going to allow us to, get our hands around what's going on in housing. We have so many people from out of state that buy houses in Cleveland, and they do so through a network of property managers. Property managers is just sort of a general term. We went with local agent in charge for the ordinance purposes, but these property managers are sort of the behind the scenes bad actors that have been fishing for out of state investors, because they knew that they could just set somebody up with an LLC in Ohio. It's like 2 pages and 2 signatures, and then never have to have any kind of responsibility for the quality of the structure. And they've been taking advantage of investors from around the world to get them to own the housing stock in Cleveland, while they get to just siphon profit off the top and not have to be held accountable. So this local agent in charge is really going to expose that industry. Now, there's lots of good people in property management. As a former realtor, I will tell you that there are really, really good people that want to do good work, and they want reputable service in that field. And those folks, I think, are going to do just fine. I think the people that don't want to maintain their units, that don't want to be accountable, those people are going to have a hard time with this. I believe, and it's in here, one of the responsibilities of the property manager is to also be responsible for violations. And that is going to mean that they will not be able to simply ignore these notices when they go out. They will have to show up in court if a violation makes it that far, and be responsible for that violation. I do know, and I will acknowledge, because it's going to be an elephant in the room, obviously anything resembling point of sale is going to be very controversial. Point of sale in the housing field comes with strong opinions on both sides. Some people swear up and down we need it, we can't live without it, and it was a shame we didn't do it 40 years ago. Some people say it's the death of the housing market and will destroy the city. And then there's lots of voices in between, and mostly voices in between. So this is going to be a very involved, detailed conversation about how we make sure that we're not penalizing the little guy. I know a guy in my neighborhood, he buys 1 house a year, he gets a residential permit, he keeps it in his name, he spends 12 months fixing a house, sometimes longer, does it at his own pace, and then sells it to an owner occupant. And it's his side hustle, right? He makes a couple of bucks off this, it's not his day job. We don't want that guy to be taxed, and we don't want to push those people out of the market, because we need them to update our housing stock. So there's going to be lots of conversation about that. But there's, I think, more to be excited about here than to be worried about. We're going to give a thorough vetting to all of it, because Chairman Hairston will make sure that everybody has their time. And I'm really looking forward to this process. This is one of the biggest issues that I ran for City Council on, is that we have to get our hands around the housing stock in this town, and especially these bad actors, property management companies that are making money off our city and contributing nothing back. So I'm very excited about this, and I look forward to a robust conversation on every aspect.
Thank you. And I'm gonna. I'm sorry, Councilman. Did you have something else to add?
I did, just briefly before we move on, because I know I see a lot of questions coming in. Councilman Hart said one thing that was really important, that we want to make sure that we hold the bad actors accountable, but not stall a lot of the good things that are happening in our neighborhoods as well. Because just like he has a gentleman in his neighborhood, I'm sure we all have that same person where we live, right? The morning that I had the first glance at the pieces, I got a call from a resident who is one of those residents, right? She has kept her family home for the last 60 years. It is the most beautiful home on the block, right? But she's also so passionate about her neighborhood and her street in particular that she has purchased 2 on her street, right? Because she didn't want folks from outside coming in and buy the properties, and then Lord knows who she's living next to, and those are her words. And what we don't want is to stop that type of good work, right? She doesn't have a lot of money. She takes a little money that she has from her day job and her investment she's made over time, and she puts back into these properties. And it takes her a year, it takes her 2 years sometimes to do the work. But we have to be sure that we don't stop that type of progress, because that's good progress that we want to see more of in our neighborhoods. And again, as Chris said, that's what we're going to take our time to vet these pieces and thoroughly go through them to hear from everyone that we, at least that we can as we begin this process.
I think minimizing unintended consequences is definitely first and foremost on our mind. You know, we want to foster home ownership. We want to encourage people like the wonderful woman that is in Councilman Hairston's neighborhood, who's doing this incredible work in her neighborhood. So we don't want to create a chilling effect. So, you know, in my slide deck, I didn't discuss, but one of the critical priorities for the Department of Building and Housing is realigning how we handle code enforcement generally. With ARPA funds, and there's about $60 million housing related money that's going out onto the street, it's an unprecedented time for people to be able to take advantage of that to repair their homes. And I know, you know, we worry about our owner occupants. We want to make sure we give them every resource that we can to help them repair their homes. But Department of Building and Housing is going to begin to pivot to a systematic code enforcement approach and away from a complaint-driven one. We obviously will always follow up on complaints, but we also want to be very intentional about what we're doing. And so we stay on a neighborhood and we send letters and we let people know we're coming, and also what resources are available to them. So in part of our work for doing, you know, getting this package put together, and, you know, there was so much behind the scenes, like Councilman Harsh said, you know, he and Zach were over working on the whiteboard, and people put in countless hours on this. But I also didn't think about, I did think about and consider consulting with, and did consult with other stakeholders, including real estate brokers, and especially commercial real estate brokers, because we certainly don't want to see a chilling effect on that market. We need to redevelop a lot of that real estate. Do we want to, you know, inhibit deals? No, we do not. You know, we want good deals to go through. And so we did spend some time with some commercial brokers. I'm also convening a realtor roundtable again, something I had done for many years in South Euclid. I talked to my good friend, Akil Hamid, who is now the president of the National Association of Realtors, and he's a realtor that has been on the southeast side of Cleveland for many years and was president of Realtus, and someone I greatly respect. He's convening a group for me, like a roundtable group. We'll all meet regularly. We've also been meeting with our CDC partners, and we're having, Building and Housing is having regular meetings with CDCs now. And I think knowing what's going on the ground, and speaking with our council partners and driving boards with our council partners, which has been absolutely essential to informing our work, is all part of this pivot that we need to do. So I'm going to call on Harriet, unless one of the panel has another comment to make, to go ahead and start posing the questions from the chat, and we can all take turns or answering them however we feel called.
Okay, Sally, I'm going to take one of the very last questions first, which is, you know, are these changes going to be available? Can we get a copy of these proposed changes? Can they go out to the participants?
Yes, absolutely. Public information. So the ordinance was read into council, so all of those changes are available. We can send that out along with the slide deck.
Okay, great. And maybe Ohio Fair Lending Coalition can send them to everybody who's participating in this.
That would be perfect.
A first comment in the chat, which Councilman Harsh addressed, is about point of sale, and it says, you know, it's definitely not a panacea. There are many parts of Cuyahoga County that have point of sale. I wondered if anybody wanted to address that before we go on.
I can speak to my own personal experience in South Euclid. This is a city that does not have point of sale and has never enforced a point of sale, and it did have a price. We did start to see a lot of deterioration in our housing stock, and until we passed vacant building, we really were struggling with flippers and speculators coming in and being the lowest common denominator, doing the least possible thing to the houses, not knowing what they were doing to the inside of the houses, because often they wouldn't pull permits. After we passed the vacant building ordinance, which is similar to what we're proposing here, we saw a 68% jump in residential permits. We got 1,000 homes that were formerly vacant back into full code compliance. It was a $200 million neighborhood investment that was facilitated through that ordinance. And so, I think there's unintended consequences for having that type of process, but I think with registration fees, we can properly staff it so that we're not behind the 8 ball and like slowing down deals. And so I would welcome the others here to chime in about that as well, because I know this is going to be a serious concern for a lot of people. But also want to make one thing clear that isn't clear in the slide deck. And that is, if you are an owner occupant purchaser and you are using a purchase rehab loan to buy that property, you would not have to post any escrow.
Yeah, Chairman, unless you want to jump in, I'll get into this, because I think that there's a couple of problems that we're trying to address. One is, I mean, it's pretty common for, owner occupants to get a housing inspection before they buy a house. It's common practice. It's best practice. You should definitely get a housing inspection before you buy a house. At which point, your housing inspector should tell you what's up with that property and what needs to be done. But Ohio, it is state law. Ohio is a buyer beware state. Buyers assume risk. And I'm not a lawyer, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm almost positive I got that part right. There is a massive problem, though, that we've seen in Cleveland, where certificates of disclosure at the point of sale do not always expose every violation. I've seen houses with my own 2 eyes over the years that had open violations that were not part of the certificate of disclosure, which was kind of just cranked out as a blank form. And that's not good either. So to me, the point of sale issue is really trying to close the gap between a certificate of disclosure that is functionally useless and the fact that the buyer does agree at some point to the terms of sale with the seller and then assumes the property as is. No one wants to see, the lady on the street who bought the house across the street pushed out of the market to better her neighborhood. That would be an absolute tragic outcome. But we also don't want to see these out-of-state investors that flip properties back and forth and don't actually get a prize of the property. So here's a real-world scenario. A local property manager who buys and sells properties for out-of-state investors wants to buy a house and flip it to another investor. So they want to buy a house from, Texas LLC and sell it to California LLC. That COD doesn't include any of the open violations that exist on that property. It makes it easier for California LLC to agree to the purchase without that LLC actually understanding what it is that they're taking on. And so I think interrupting that chain of sales is a good thing. We don't want to see houses continually flipped, which actually has bad consequences for the housing market as well. And point of sale, I think, is going to be where that conversation happens in terms of how we do that. So that's just a little bit of framing, I think, of the conversation.
Thank you. Any other comments before we go on? A second comment says no one on the dream team from the real estate market, brokers, sales, or title companies. Do others from academics that may be able to look at unintended consequences? Sally, you certainly addressed the fact that you have had extensive conversations with brokers and real estate people. So maybe we don't, if there's no other comments, I'll go on.
I would say we plan to have more conversations with them, especially in this public process. We anticipate that they will definitely come forward to want to talk publicly about that. I did meet with several. The table that we had, we would spend 2.5, 3 hours at a time hashing over these pieces. And of course, people who are out trying to sell property aren't going to want to devote that kind of time to sit here and deep dive on our legislation. But we've certainly been out and about. So thanks for the question.
I was a realtor. I certainly wasn't prolific, but I think I understand how the real estate market works. And we are going to hear from the realtors. They're not going to be shut out of this conversation at all. They will be at the table, and they will definitely be important partners in this. We're not going to shut down the housing market in Cleveland.
And I'll just wrap up with this last point is that, as I said earlier, through the committee process as chair of DPNS, that we will absolutely have conversations and allow folks not only at the table, but if there's those who would like to interact, even outside of the committee hearing process to share comments, questions, concerns, we are always open for those discussions.
Okay, a next question, a very important question. Is there enough staff to carry out these changes? What are the means for enforcement?
So we've done a deep dive into looking at that. And if this passes, our intent is to add an entire team to handle vacant building. And so we should be able to do that with no issue, given the fact that the fees that we're charging for it will cover the cost of that. So we've definitely forecasted what we need. We believe that, our administration, for sure, the BIB administration values this work so much that it's absolutely understood that we need to add capacity to do it. And one of the things that we brought up yesterday at Chairman Hairston's committee was that we have recently ratified a new union contract where we have approved a new category of inspector called a property maintenance inspector, which is more of an entry-level role. And before, the city had not had those type of inspectors. We've had we've had RBIs and BIs, which are certified inspection staff, which is fabulous, but they're very hard to attract. So there's only a finite number of them, and all the cities are fighting over them. And so we believe that we need more bodies on the street generally. And so our intent is to begin recruiting those very soon. So tell your friends, if you know somebody who would like to work as property maintenance inspector, have them look for our posting because it's coming soon. So we are, regardless of whether this passes, we'll be adding additional capacity to the department to be able to pivot toward that proactive approach.
And I will say that staffing is one of my biggest concerns. City Council actually increased Building and Housing's budget this year above what they asked. And Chairman Harrison was all about that, right? Because we all recognize that department needs people to make sure that we have a safe city to live in. Staffing is always going to be a primary concern, but I think City Council is going to be dedicated to making sure that this works.
So this may be off topic, but somebody asks, what about enforcement on owner-occupied homes? The owner-occupied home next to my rental home has peeling lead paint.
Our intent is to enforce the code. However, with owner occupants, we want to certainly link that with resources. So where they don't have the money to make the repairs, we want to be sure that we're providing them with enough resources to be able to do that and become code compliant. So, we will be looking at that. We will be doing neighborhood sweeps for code enforcement in a proactive way, similar to what's done in the suburbs. But hand in glove with that is pushing them towards resources that are available, especially right now, because there's an unprecedented amount of resources that are out there that have not been out there before.
And if I can jump in before we move on, director's right. And that's one of the things that really City Council made clear as we began to hear ARPA request, right? You know, what are our priorities? And when we were approached to support the property survey, we absolutely say yes. You know, we saw the effects of it from the initial survey, and we saw the good work and the resources that went into supporting those results that happened on the first survey. And when we yesterday we had a presentation by Isaac Robb from the West Reserve Land Conservancy, Tim Colby, and our director. And I believe that survey will help us to further guide resources where they are needed. That information is so useful. So now we don't have to guess where should we deploy more home repair dollars. You know, what are the conditions in this neighborhood, on this block? Where are the legal dumping issues? So that survey is really going to help guide a lot of our decision making and where we allocate more resources and at what levels we allocate resources. Because all of us can say, well, we can pick a number, 5 million. Let's put 5 million towards home repair. Well, is that the need? Well, we may need more in this bucket. We may need less in that bucket. And so all of this will help guide us as we look to make better and more informed decisions on how and where we allocate resources to support all of the work.
A next comment is just, of course, the cost of HVAC inspection will be passed along to tenants in the form of a rent increase. I'm not sure what you can say about that, but undoubtedly that's true. Here's someone asking, what can we do about who to contact on unsafe sidewalk conditions?
So one of the interesting parts of the survey was to document the sidewalk conditions in front of every single parcel in the city. So while they can certainly call and report sidewalk conditions to us, we're happy to take that complaint. We know where they are, and this information is being used by our sidewalk division to go out proactively and start addressing the problem. So we appreciate that question, but we are already on top of that. And I think the purpose in part of the survey was to document infrastructure issues like sidewalks, curbs, street trees, fire hydrants. So all of that was documented in our survey, which had about 56 questions per property that we were looking at. So it wasn't just building and housing related, it was for other departments such as sidewalks, which happens to not be in the Department of Building and Housing.
And Director, if I can add on to that, you know, the city has a 50-50 program for residential households that the city will split the cost to repair a sidewalk in and around your property. And I think that because of, again, the survey will tell us what home are occupied, and a lot of it we can determine if it is, owner occupied. And as Director mentioned, linking the resources to the individuals who may have been flagged to have one of these violations is key. And sidewalks is one of them. You know, there's many calls we get, my sidewalk out front. Oh, I didn't know we had that. I didn't know the city had that program. The council funds this program every single year. And I'm sure that we will continue to fund this program because we see how impactful it has been to help residents who can't afford $1,000 to fix a couple pads in front of their home. But $500, they can probably work that into their budget over a period of time. And so that still exists.
Next question, please speak to elevators in working order. We are encountering situations where out of 2 elevators, passenger and freight, one out of service for years, the other works sporadically. Why aren't properties required to have both elevators working?
So part of the code, really forces them to have one elevator if it's above a 4-story building, 4 and above. So that's state code. Now, if you have multiple elevators, they're supposed to be kept in good working conditions unless you decommission one of them. So I know the problem, and I think Jay's posed the question. Jay's doing all the organizing the Shaker Square area quite well, quite amazingly, actually. We've had so many problems with these buildings, having, say, 2 elevators and maybe a freight elevator, and then only keeping one of the elevators working and that one is just held together with chewing gum and duct tape, and then will eventually fail, and then there's no elevator. And so I think it's something we need to really push on in the coming year. Either working with at the state level to say, no, we don't want them to have to decommission it, but they're building new buildings with one elevator. So, they're doing what they have to do to meet the code, but barely. And in some of these buildings, not at all. And I'm going to agree with you that it's a huge problem that we're fighting every day.
Next question. Can you explain the role and responsibilities of the local agent? What legal responsibilities is the local agent assuming?
I'm going to call on Chief Assistant Director of Law Code Enforcement for that question.
Well, the basic idea is that they are accountable for the repairs that need to be made. Now, what we know, of course, is if you are hired by an owner and there are expensive repairs, it's not coming out of your salary. So then we expect the agents are going to say, well, I can't put a new roof on. I can only take that to the owner. And so their responsibility may be limited. And in addition, what may happen is if you're not a good landlord, not a good investor, you won't be able to keep your local agent in charge because they won't want to be brought to court behind your refusal to pay. And then the local agent in charge, I imagine, would resign at that point and say, I can't, be accountable for a house if a person hiring me won't put the money in to invest in the house. And then we would prosecute the owner for not having the local agent in charge. And so that is the tension that we imagine. The important thing is you have a person, you don't have an LLC out of Utah or some foreign country, and we just can't get anyone to come in and be accountable at all. And so now we have a person. So we're going to be, we're going to be fair to that person, but we want that person to be someone so we can at least get the court prosecution process started.
I think one thing that makes this such a tough nut to crack is that they're playing a shell game. They hide specifically behind paperwork so that they can avoid accountability and responsibility for these properties. And unfortunately, the laws in Ohio allow them to do that quite easily. They can set up an LLC and sign a private, management contract that no one ever has to look at or see. And they're really, I do my own housing inspections in Old Brooklyn, and I find, 4 or 5% of my properties have the properties in the neighborhood have major problems, and it's almost entirely always every single time an out-of-state owned house. It's almost always, and they're specifically trying to avoid responsibility. So we have to figure this out, and I think that this local agent in charge is our best chance to do this. And I think that we're really getting this one right. I think this is going to be really, really helpful.
I concur with Councilman Harsh that, this, after reviewing so many options and having so many discussions, this really came down to being the best way to be able to address these situations. Again, as I said earlier, I personally went through this situation trying to figure out who own these properties, and they end up in UK somewhere after I finally tracked down someone who just did the paperwork for them to create the entity for them to put the property in the names. And it's so frustrating because we get the calls from the residents. Residents call them because they have to live next to these owner-occupied properties are living next to these horrible conditions. And you feel bad because it's nothing really that you can do. You try hard to reach folks. You call building housing 4 or 5 times. They go out and write all these violation notices and these tickets, and they're summoned to court and nobody shows, right? And so everyone within that process feels defeated. The resident ultimately are the most affected out of all of this, and it leads to anything. So again, I concur with Councilman Harsh that I believe that this is really that way for us to put our hands on individuals to get at least a response when there are situations like these, like we all know of, that line our streets.
Okay, I just want to say that I see some on my screen that someone has raised a hand. I have no ability to track raised hands, so please put your questions in the chat. The next question is, how will the public comment period be advertised so that residents can have their input heard?
So we will make sure that it is on our city council website when our calendar calendar goes out Thursday or Friday every week. It will be highlighted in those communications from our council staff. We'll also make sure that we get that information to the Building and Housing Department as well, so if they would like to share that. And then I'm happy to send it over to the group here, Chip and his colleagues, to make sure they get that out as well.
Okay, great. Just a comment from someone who says, measure twice, cut once. My motto for life. Next, and a comment from Zach Germaniak. He'd like to credit my law clinic students at CSU, in particular, Dr. Paul Hergum-Roeder, who assisted in preparing the legal and legislative abstracts, which informed the process. Another question. As a property manager and licensed Ohio real estate broker, well, she says she's offended by your comments, Councilman Harsh.
Wait,
next
which,
one.
Which comment? Which comment? I love the real estate industry. What? There are bad actors, though. There are good actors. There's a little bit of everybody, right? That's it.
And you did say that.
I did. There's great realtors. There are wonderful property managers. There are people that do really good work. We want to elevate them and support them.
Exactly. And in the chat, there was no specific thing mentioned. Question, there are many low-income homeowners without the means to immediately comprehensive address code issues and deferred maintenance with their properties. Will the city be exploring a revamp or expansion of programs such as aid-friendly SHAP, etc.? Will additional home repair dollars be put on the street? I think you have answered that, Sally, but would you like to make more comments?
Not to speak for Director Hernandez, but I know that she's looking very closely at those existing programs and how to improve them. So I would say yes. I think all of this is on the table right now, and I think the ARPA money being out there is a game-changing proposition. And I should say it's not quite out there, but it's coming out there very shortly. So in time for us to make all of these fundamental changes to the way we're operating building and housing, there should be fundamentally much more money on the street and hopefully refined programs that will really help people meet those requirements.
Yeah, and I'll follow up to Director Martin's comments. Council is very much engaged in those conversations as well, because again, we get the calls as well on a high level about, hey, I applied for this application, I put this application, I applied for this program, but it's been 6 months, it's been 5 months, and we have not heard back. And so Councilman Harsh in particular, along with some other colleagues, we are part of conversations within City Hall to talk about how do we speed up the process, right? What needs to change within the process to better get these dollars out onto the streets quicker. One in particular is the AFIP program that goes to the Department of Aging. With the amount of money that is allocated per ward, you may get 6 to 10 projects per ward. Not a lot of projects. However, if the program is able to be put out into the streets a bit quicker, then maybe we can realize the impact a little sooner. And so that is something that AFIP in particular, that we're going through now to figure out how do we streamline that process while working with the Department of Aging as well.
Thank you. New question. Is the Cleveland Housing Court on board with these changes and prepared for these new cases?
I can speak to that. We briefed Judge Monet Scott, our housing court judge, and she had, like most of us, she had issues and questions, but she was excited to hear that there was a revamp. And then in question of whether she is prepared to take on the new cases, I can tell you she is prepared to take on any cases we bring. She's committed to that, her role as housing judge. And so if we bring the cases, she and her staff will handle the cases.
New question is, if a residential property owner is looking to purchase an adjacent vacant lot and it is owned by a corporation, will that lot remain undeveloped and unavailable forever?
Yeah, I saw that one, so I was thinking about it. I mean, anything owned by a corporation, you have to be able to find that corporation to communicate with them if you're trying to buy a lot from a company. So tracking down a corporation that owns an empty lot is a challenge. And I think that this agent in charge legislation would actually make that a little bit easier, because we could actually find somebody in town who says, oh yeah, I'm their agent for that corporation. I can put you in touch with them, because corporations can be hard to find. But the development of a lot is pretty much up to the owner, whether or not they want to develop the lot. We can't, dictate that.
New question, are there federal energy conservation funds which can be accessed for home repair?
I mean, there are weatherization grants from the federal government that are available through CHN Housing Partners. And you can contact CHN Housing Partners for those programs. I think the very, very kind income cap on that most folks would qualify for.
Okay. Another question is, do these new ordinances include HUD housing units?
We're talking about units owned by the Cuyahoga Metropolitan Housing Authority. Is that?
I believe it's not specific. It's not specified, but I
guess
believe.
what I would say to that is that, we work really, really closely with CMHA, and I'm not anticipating that CMHA is going to be doing a lot of transfers of residential parcels. But they have been a good actor for us. We've been working with them, especially on lead safe things, and they've been very, very cooperative and very compliant.
Next question, is the task force work focused only on residential properties, or will it include commercial and or industrial properties? You've partly answered that, but.
All.
Okay. How were the voices, perspectives, and concerns of tenants incorporated into crafting these legislative changes?
Well, I will tell you that Phil Starr was on our work group. He's always very vocal for tenants. As you may all know, he was the one that started the Cleveland Tenants Organization back in the day. He's an attorney, and he's always got tenants' rights first and foremost on his mind. So he was one of our main participants in the group. But in addition, I think all of us were leading with that thinking, because Zach Germanek has, one of our main people on the group as well, has really represented a number of tenants, especially in the Slavic Village area. And so we're always worried about them. All the work we've been doing with the Shaker Morelands group in Shaker Square, the city has filed 4 receivership actions in that area on apartment buildings with derelict owners. We've been meeting with tenants regularly. So our belief is that this package of legislation is going to benefit tenants quite directly. And I understand the criticism of, well, they're just going to pass these costs on. And I know many of you who are participating today understand some of the conditions that we're seeing in a lot of these multi-unit buildings and how terrible they are. And if you understand also how they're being gouged on rent in some of these buildings, they're paying $1,100 a month in a building that doesn't have heat. It's egregious, and it's time for us to enforce the code. And so I hope what it leads to is the derelict owners deciding they want to be out of the business and moving on to some more beneficial owners who are not going to gouge and create horrible hazardous conditions for their tenants. So I think the benefit of taking a hard line and enforcing the code, it shouldn't hurt tenants, it should help them. All of those Shaker tenants who've had to put their rent in escrow for months and living with rats and rodents and no water from time to time. It's completely morally corrupt.
And I think it's also just worth mentioning too that we're not done here, right? A lot of months went into crafting this and getting this ready. And I think that at some point when you're working on legislation like this, ordinances like this, you have to contemplate the too many cooks in the kitchen problem. If you got too many people, you always just end up with soup and it's got every single thing in the fridge in it, right? So we had a dedicated group of people that this is their field, this is what they've been working on for a long time, come up with this. And I commend Director O'Toole for rolling this out publicly. This hasn't gotten to Chairman Hairston yet for the table discussions. The director is making this all publicly known and being very forward facing and outward with this, so that I believe when it's on the DPS table for Chairman Hairston, everybody in town should know what's going on. And I think that the director's doing a really good job of making sure that people are aware of this, so that when we get to the next vital step, which is DPS pulling this whole thing apart and looking at it, everybody should be aware of what's happening at that point, and all the voices will be heard. We're not going to shut anybody out or keep anybody, we want to hear from everybody. We got email, we got phones, we got open meetings, we're on YouTube. Like, everything we do is transparent. And so that will be the next step of this, and all voices are welcome. And then, at the end, we'll have a final piece of legislation that goes up.
This is part of the measure twice.
Right.
This is part of the measure twice. This is the beginning, not the end.
Okay, next comment says, slightly related, what is the process for a resident or church to take over ownership of adjacent vacant lots to try to enhance the community?
I believe our land bank manager answered the question.
Yeah, he answered it. Mm-hmm.
If the parcel is in the city land bank, there's an application process whereby the project is reviewed by city planning, the local CDC, and the council person. So an answer was posted. Okay. A new question, aren't the fees generated by B&H going to the general fund? How do we advocate to keep these funds in building and housing?
Chairman, you want that one?
Hot potato. I'm punting that to Councilman.
Well,
Councilman.
This is welcome to a decades-old debate. You're here for it now too.
I'm telling you, I'm going to say this goes back many years. Council will, in fact, we are changing the way we look at our budget process. In fact, this fall we will be going through each of the departments to look at operations, staffing, and so forth. And this will help inform our decisions come February when we look at the actual numbers and where we intend to add, where we intend to take away, where we intend to set to the side, and this new process was developed by council staff policy member Joe Titron, who really sat back along with leadership. Joe, I know Joe was listening here, who sat back and analyzed the way we look at our budget and how we've looked at our budget for decades, and believe that this process will better inform our decisions. And maybe, just maybe, that decades old debate and conversation may be solved, with this new way of reviewing our budget. In the past, it allowed us for days, not really weeks, to reconcile the budget and really figure out where the need is. And this lead time would allow us to really analyze our budget and see where our deficiencies exist and where we can help departments like building and housing be more effective. I hope that answered.
Okay, I'm sure you'll be held accountable. Some entering suburbs are looking to remove exterior point of sales and advocating towards systematic code enforcement every 3 years. Does anybody want to comment on that?
Thank you, Tony. I think I saw the question. I think in an ideal world, I think systematic code enforcement, regular code enforcement is where we want to get. I mean, I think that's just like sort of the level we want to get to. But That's all I have on that.
I think some cities have gotten spooked away from point of sale for various reasons, and we're not advocating it here. Let's just be clear. I mean, this is vacant building. It's a separate category of parcel. It's not every parcel in Cleveland. So I can just speak to the fact that even though South Euclid did systematic code enforcement for decades and constantly, did portions of the city every year, walked around the entire exterior of every house and did rental inspections every 3 years inside and out, we still had a gaping hole with vacant building. In what we did really did solve it. And so what I guess I should stress too is that this is really an iterative process. This is something that if we try it, it doesn't work, we change it. And I think everybody here is dedicated to learning from whatever we're trying. But we miss every shot we don't take.
Okay, new question. What are the protocols for inspectors following up on violations and inspections?
They need to be better. So I guess what I can say to that, and I'll just be brutally honest, I don't think the follow-up is there, and mostly because I think what we have is jack of all trades, master of none in the existing system. They're out trying to inspect permits. They're out trying to do code enforcement. They have to go back and follow up on things. And while they work very hard at it and they do their absolute best, I think the way the system is set up isn't well designed for good follow-up. And so that's what we're striving to change and dramatically improve the follow-up that we're seeing. We do see it, of course. I mean, they are following up, but it's not as fast as what council would want. It's not as fast as what I would want. And so, again, another iterative process. We're going to restructure that department and we are going to try something different and see if we get a different result. But I know if we keep trying the same thing, we're not going to get a different result. So there we go.
Oh, a direct and related question. How many, from Ron O'Leary, how many more staff members will you add? How much will you increase the budget?
Well, I don't know yet, Ron. I mean, it all depends on if they pass all of this and we need to add a vacant building team. We know we have existing positions that we haven't been able to fill. We are hoping the gap can be filled by property maintenance inspectors. And I did see a question in the chat about how, no, you need people who are really certified. I agree with you. I think it's very important to have a lot of building inspectors and residential building inspectors on the staff, and we certainly will keep hiring them as they are available. But I disagree with you in that you will get a very professional inspector that you train well, carefully, that knows our laws, that can interact with residents well and lead them to resources and do all of those things. But for exterior bodies in the field looking at peeling paint and hanging gutters, you really don't need to be a BI or an RBI to do that. And most suburbs have acknowledged that, and they have housing inspectors who do that work without certifications and do it well. So I think, it will allow us to staff up more rapidly than if we are just restricting what we're doing to BIs and RBIs.
This question, I believe, for you, Chief Roberts. Does the law department have sufficient resources to follow through with prosecution when there is non-compliance with property maintenance, along with non-compliance of the various new regulatory licensing requirements?
Well, the immediate answer would be yes. I've got 3 new prosecutors and I have going to have a team of 8. I need 2 more positions filled. Now, the larger question would be this: to the extent that we begin to shift requirements to property owners to register, to inspect their own properties, to inspect their own parking garages, to ensure that their properties are lead safe, and then the volume of cases, if they don't do that, may increase, and then we may need more prosecutors. But for now, we have enough prosecutors. I can imagine a future where I need more, but I imagine then the law department budget would include a request for more. So I'm not concerned about that as any kind of reason not to move forward with all these legislative changes.
Thank you. From Frank Ford, can we repeat the question about rent increases being a possible result of enforcement? Some of it is the reality of not being in a jurisdiction with rent control, but some rent increases in response to enforcement could be retaliatory under state law.
Yeah, I actually wanted to answer. That's why I put my hand up a second ago. I wanted to talk about that because I know it's going to be a major issue. And I think that there's a couple, with regards to that question, Frank, we operate under different realities with different owners. At one end of the spectrum, we have the worst property investors imaginable, and at the other end, we have the best property managers imaginable. But whenever anyone enters into the residential real estate market for profit, whenever somebody decides, I'm going to buy houses so that I can rent them out to make money, we ought to have an expectation as a society that that person is going to be able to invest in those properties and maintain the quality of living for those tenants. Residential inspectors that don't meet that expectation are not good residential property owners in our community. Those are likely to be the people that will want to pass on all costs to their tenants. And this is a problem. It's a problem whenever you change expectations or raise the bar. Some people are going to force somebody else to do the lifting. And it's a problem because when you lower the bar and those people flood your market, then you've got to contend with them. So I don't want to say that it will never happen, because I understand that some landlords are just kind of cruel and will do that. But over time, as the expectations are set, as the bar gets raised and people know what is to be expected, it's my hope that the long-term trajectory of our housing stock will go up. It's also my expectation that we will be clear with investors. When you rent a home and you're trying to make money, maintenance is part of your business strategy, and maintaining that home and the repairs necessary needs to be built into your business model. And really good property managers know that. Really good property managers have percentages that they put aside every single month into repair funds so that their properties are maintained at expected levels. So really, this is where the good actor and the bad actor diverge. And that's going to happen. I don't really know how we can avoid it, but I'm definitely all ears for suggestions on how best to handle that.
Hey, Sally, I think you addressed the next question. Knowledgeable and effective property maintenance inspectors are hardly an entry-level role, but you have talked about that, so I assume we've covered that. Also from Frank Ford, another factor is the loss of the Cleveland Tenants Organization. There's only minimal tenant organizing capacity at this time. Organizing and empowering tenants would provide leverage to negotiate rent increases. Okay, new question. Will there be someone to contact if we need to expedite transfer of a property? Any holdup often leaves people homeless.
The way this is being proposed, you would have a certificate of inspection that would be valid for an entire year. So if you wait until the last minute to do it, that wouldn't be a really advisable idea. We ran into this in South Euclid also, that you kind of need to plan ahead and try to get the inspection, but yes, you certainly would be able to call us. And this is predicated on this passing council, because this is not law yet. So remember that. We're still talking.
Oh, an interesting question. Should we be advocating state and or federal legislation to address LLC issues?
Everybody's saying yes. I'm sorry. Some of them are muted. Go ahead. Here's, I think, yes, obviously, it would be a really good thing, and there are some things happening on the state level. Senator Blessings has been really productive in this area, but I don't think Cleveland should sit around. I don't sit around is probably not the right word, but we should not be waiting for that, because we have to handle the problem in our own backyard before we expect somebody else to handle the problem in our backyard.
No, I agree.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Director. I was just going to say that, I agree that, that's part of why, council and administration has really jumped in this together to begin to review our policies to figure out what can we do locally. as we hear so many conversations from folks around our city, well, what can we do? We can't sit idle and wait for the state and the federal government to solve our problems for us. But within what mechanisms we have, what can we do? And I think this begins to address some of those concerns. Director.
I was just going to say that I believe we have a very good friend in Sherrod Brown here, because he knows about these issues, and he's convened committee meetings on these topics, and he keeps exploring what they can do on a federal level. And we want to keep talking with him. And also, we have been very heartened to see Senator Blessing taking on some of these topics and doing his best with a state house that doesn't make that easy. But we're not going to give up there. We'll keep advocating. But I think the councilmen are right about this. I mean, we have to do what we can do here the best we can.
You act and you ask for forgiveness later, because folks will argue, well, is this, we open ourselves up for litigation issues. Well, hey, I mean, we do what we have to do. We ask for forgiveness later.
Thank you.
Folks, I can tell you from experience, every time you change a law, you open yourself up to litigation. That's how laws work.
New question. Is this, I assume, meaning this legislative practice, how we address online sheriff sales? How do we go about doing this? Is there anything in the works already?
So some years ago, the state passed legislation to require sheriff sales to be online, and it has been a bit of a game-changing proposition. And we have seen more out-of-state investors purchasing at sheriff sale. When it was live and in person, that wasn't going on. So obviously, we're doing the best we can with what we have, and we certainly those properties will have to comply with the law. And if they don't, we'll prosecute. So that's basically all I could say about that.
A new question. Why can't the city just forfeit a nuisance property?
Dave, I don't know if you want to expound, but essentially, I think what he's saying is, why can't we forcibly take it? Well, when we demolish a private property, which we do all the time, and I know there were some questions there about demolition. Well, the city just needs to demolish. The city's demolishing every single day, and we've taken advantage of several grant opportunities, and we believe we can finish the blight removal job in the next few years. So that is planned, but that is a taking of property in many respects, and then we put our lien on, and then we end up with the property through tax foreclosure. So typically that's how a city or a land bank would get property is, you lien it for the nuisance liens, and then it goes into tax foreclosure. And I really don't see an appetite for going eminent domain anytime soon, but I don't know. I'd let the council people expound on that.
I mean, I'm a little bit confused about the question. Like, we can't really, we don't forfeit. I don't quite understand that question entirely. So unless they want to restate it or something,
I'm sorry, I was responding to someone in the chat now about the rent escrow program through the housing court. We have to restate the question.
Okay, I've read it exactly as is.
Yeah, but we don't what do they mean by forfeit property? What does that mean? Like, the city forfeit?
Yeah, I think
property?
I agree. I think we just got to go on to the next question.
I think that's just maybe.
Next question. At the
term.
state and federal level, government can pierce the corporate veil if certain taxes aren't paid, even in the event of bankruptcy. Is there a way to pass legislation that non-passive investors of partnerships or corporations can be held liable personally for non-compliance of these housing code violations?
That's a Dave Roberts question, and I'm here to hear the answer.
I am thinking of the 15 years I spent working for Ray Pianka at the housing court, and he would ask about every week about how could we pierce the corporate veil and make the people behind the company responsible. It's kind of a cornerstone of American law and law around the world. that you do allow an LLC or a corporation, and it does represent a the fact that you cannot reach through to the ultimate investor. And so that would be a giant change in the law. What you can do is you could pierce the veil if you can show that the person has a sham LLC, and they're just using it as a way to put a kind of distance between themselves. They're not registering it. They're not observing the form of it. But that is pretty difficult to prove because you generally don't know the ins and outs of what the person is doing. And so seldom is the case when the city is able to pierce the veil and hold the individuals accountable, unfortunately.
Next comment is eminent domain would require payment to the owner, forfeiture does not.
I don't know if the people are imagining what's called a state forfeiture. If you get a tax foreclosure sale, property is offered for auction and anyone who's willing to pay the minimum bid can take the property. If that happens and no one will bid, then there is a process called state forfeiture. It doesn't actually forfeit to the state. What it means is the rights are now forfeited and the property can then be transferred to a local political subdivision, which can take it, a land bank, which can take it, or it can go to a forfeiture sale, and then the forfeiture sale minimum is much lesser. And in fact, that's where you get a lot of very unhappy, or for us, unhappy speculators who will buy it because it seems so inexpensive. You might get a property for $500, and people imagine that at least they could flip it for more than $500. And then what they may find is that they've just bought a negative value property because it's probably needs to be demolished, and then the owner has taken on the debt for the demolition. And so that process of forfeiture, if the land bank or the city is interested in having the property, that can lead to a forfeiture where the city takes it. But this land bank or the city may not want it, and then that's not a useful procedure.
Hey, the next comment said this one is known and currently developing in the city. I'm not sure I understand what exactly they're referring to. It comes after the eminent domain would require payment to the owner comment. So I think I'll go on. Ohio Senator Louis Blessing introduced a bill that would impose a financial penalty on bulk owners, but there was significant pushback. I believe he is going to reintroduce the bill to push for greater disclosure of who is behind LLCs to hold them accountable.
I'll comment on that briefly because I think it's frustrating for a lot of folks when we confront the fact that you can sell to anybody who wants to buy from you. Buying and selling is legal transaction. You know, property owners can sell to people they want to buy, and buyers can buy from people that want to sell. I think we're gonna have a really hard time with that because, you know, it's buying and selling property is why private property exists, right? If there were no buying and selling property, we wouldn't need private property, or have private property. So I think that's just it's a big, you know, maybe discussion for another day. But at the end of the day, if somebody wants to sell something and somebody wants to buy it, they form a contract and they execute it. And there are very few laws that can interrupt that transaction.
Okay, two related things. One person says, as an investor landlord, we always raise rents with extra costs that we incur from every direction. The next comment says, why is this not?
Oh, I'm sorry. Let's pause there. I apologize. As an investor landlord, you have a certain expectation for profit that you're going to make every single month off your investment. That expectation for profit gets challenged if there are requirements to spend more money on the investment than you're getting out of profit. And that's the formula that we're asking people to think about. How much money should you make off residential investment? Some people have low expectations, some people have high expectations. And it's really hard to know whether or not you as an investor's expectations are too high or too low. And yeah, it's easy for a landlord to say, I'm going to pass on every cost because they can, but we have leases for this reason. Tenants should be in leases. They should renew leases. I hate the month to month. Tenants should, negotiate their lease every 12 months. That's good practice. And if the car's not running and you take it to the mechanic and the mechanic says, you need to buy, new tires, am I going to pass that, on to my kids? I don't know. I don't think so. I think it's just part of owning the property, right? So we're going to hear this a lot.
Okay, the next comment says, why is this not a part of planned maintenance? I cannot ask for a raise when I run into repairs for my home. I know of a building with seniors that has had over $400 in monthly increases in the last 5 years.
Exactly.
Okay.
Planned maintenance.
Right.
One last question, Harriet, because we're gonna have to wrap at
Okay, it's a
1:45.
very important question. It says, time frame for getting this legislation passed.
Hairston.
I'm here. Well, we will, as the pieces come back to council, and once we receive them, we will quickly tee them up for a hearing. I can't predict how quickly they will pass because we have several other members who sits on our committee. And again, everything takes it's a majority in order to move things out of committee. But we would do our best to move them along as fast as we can without losing anyone along the way in terms of input.
Can you even speculate whether, say, it might be finished by the end of the year?
I learned a long time before, if I give a time or a date, you would be held to that. Again, I would say that we will work expeditiously with the administration to vet these pieces and do our best to get them moved along as quickly as possible.
Thank you very much.
All right, well, I am so grateful for everyone's participation and all the wonderful questions. It was a great dialogue today. And thank you to all the panelists, Councilman Harsh, Councilman Hairston, and Chief Assistant Director of Law of Code Enforcement, Dave Roberts. This isn't the last you'll be hearing about this. We'll be out talking in the community. We're going to have some realtor focus groups coming up soon, and we look forward to getting everyone's input so that we can make this the absolute best package it can possibly be to help our neighborhoods.
I guess I should also mention that this whole session was recorded and will be available to people.
Thank you, everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Have a good day, everybody.